Okay, so David Brainerd. Yeah, so we are ready for number five. He makes an unwise move early in his ministry. At least some would consider it unwise. Maybe not everybody, but what happened was you may recall from your reading that he met an older couple that had been involved in missions work for quite a while. And he's a young man and he's single and he's inexperienced. He's very intelligent, but intelligence doesn't compensate for experience. And so this couple offered to actually take him under their wing and give him some training, some mentoring. But he wanted to get on with his ministry to the Native Americans where he felt God was leading him. So he declined that offer. And some think, that he probably could have saved himself some grief and perhaps some mistakes if he had taken some time to work with them. People at your age can sometimes, and this may not be true of you, I'm not going to put everybody in this category, but it's easy at your stage, especially when you get close to finishing your college career, to start thinking, I got to get on with what I'm doing. I'm done with school now. I'm ready to jump in. And that's good. And if God opens the door that way for you to jump in, and then God bless you. But it doesn't always work that way. And sometimes it's a gradual getting done here and moving into the area where you're going to be working. It's going to be different for everybody. I personally, and I'm not an expert on David Brainerd, but just from what I've read, I personally think that maybe it would have done him good to work with a couple. They were working with Native Americans, so it's not like it was a totally different kind of ministry. But he saw the urgency, and urgency is okay, but urgency can also force us to sometimes jump the gun and get in too big of a hurry. So that's what we mean by an unwise move early in his ministry. So he goes from the Bay Colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, all the way to Pennsylvania, and he begins a ministry there. So here you go. Here's Philadelphia, and you can see Harrisburg over here, which is actually where ABWE's headquarters are. So this is the general area that we're looking at. Of course, that was all inhabited by Native Americans at that time. That would have been considered the West. I'm from Ohio, and I remember reading Ohio was considered, the far West, basically. It's pretty. What was his attitude? Okay, here's a guy who's going to be working with Native Americans. So tell me, what would you expect his attitude toward the Indians to be?
Well, you expect him to have a good attitude towards them if he's trying to minister to them.
Yeah, and good. Can you flesh that out a little bit? You're right, but
like kind. I don't know.
All right. Compassionate. Yeah.
What's the compassion you said it? So.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, good.
Now, I'm not saying he wasn't, but
to see them as people made in the image of God, maybe.
Okay, which was not necessarily a given at that time, right? A lot of people viewed Native Americans kind of the way they sometimes viewed slaves as being, less than human or having only half of a soul or something weird like that, So, yeah, did you remember reading anything about what actually happened? How he sometimes reacted to the Native Americans? Notice I use the word Indians here. You'll understand I'm using it more in the historical sense. What did happen?
Was he trying to, maybe in a sense colonize them or change them to more modern standards or get frustrated with them?
I don't see him doing that personally. I mean, John Eliot got kind of involved in that, and he may have somewhat, but that wasn't the main problem. He actually seemed to blend in a little bit more to the Indian culture than some others would have. I don't remember the exact page that it's on. Um, Brainerd, on page 82, Brainerd blamed himself for his lack of success, but he also blamed the Indians. He found them, quote, brutishly stupid and ignorant of divine things, end quote.
Wow.
And I mean, let's face it, let's just be humble enough to say that God could say that about all of us, you know? But it's easy in ministry. If things aren't moving along the way that you like them to or you think they should be, it's very easy to lash out against the people you're trying to minister to and blaming them for being so stupid or, and not responding. He did struggle with that. Now, we already saw something in him. Remember when he lashed out against the teacher and got himself in trouble? So he's not totally over that, He still has to deal with himself. He says, given to asking frivolous and impertinent questions. Well, if you're going to minister to people that have very little knowledge of the Bible, then what kind of questions can you expect? You know what I mean? They're going to ask frivolous and impertinent questions because they don't really even know what to ask sometimes. And so when that happens, we have to be so patient with people, When you're teaching a children's Sunday school class, for example, and they ask a question like that, you don't jump all over them because you understand they're children, they're just learning. And so he lacked a little bit in patience. He had a hard time being patient with them. Yeah. Yeah, in summing up Brainerd's attitudes toward Native Americans, the bottom of the page, another historian writes, modern readers may wonder whether Yale College in officially expelling Brainerd for rudeness may actually have sought to rid itself of one of its dimmer scholars. So that was a guy that apparently wasn't too impressed with Brainerd. But look, Brainerd was like the rest of us. He had his shortcomings. He had his areas one thing we cannot take away from him is his determination to try to reach the people God had put on his heart. But it is ironic that sometimes missionaries can actually develop very bad attitudes toward the very people they're trying to reach. I remember sometimes struggling with that in Brazil. And, you'd hear things about Brazilians and you'd sometimes latch onto those and say, yeah, I've experienced that in my ministry. It's kind of like Paul writing to Titus, and he refers to the Cretans as being slow bellies, sluggish sluggards. And he says this testimony is true. So anyway, just something I would encourage you guys to be careful of. It's very easy to become resentful of the very people God has sent you to reach. If you do that, it's going to be hard. So he leaves. He's having a hard time getting settled. He's impatient with them, and he figures, okay, there must be another tribe somewhere else that's more open. He wants to find a group that really is interested in hearing his message. So he ends up actually going to New Jersey, and then he begins a love life with whom? Who's he start a relationship with? If you don't remember her name, do you remember who she's related to, who's very well known? And it is important you remember this because I think it has something to do with the reason why we know Brainerd so well and talk about his ministry so much. Her name was Jerusha, but her dad is Jonathan Edwards. Now that name, right? Jonathan Edwards is still to this day considered one of the greatest theologians in American history. He was Reformed. We wouldn't agree with some of his theology, but a brilliant guy, very, very timid kind of a guy. My wife and I just read in the book that you guys are reading, the 25 Surprising Marriages, at least you're going to be. We read the one about him and his wife. So
Jonathan Edwards or
Jonathan Edwards. Yep, his daughter is Jerusha. Yep, he was in Massachusetts. And you've heard of the Great Awakenings, right? The first Great Awakening, the second Great Awakening. He was in the middle of all that. He had a lot to do with a revival, a spiritual revival going on in the colonies at that time. So David Brainerd, when he's in the area, he develops a relationship with her. And, you know, every indication is they would have gotten married, except what happens?
He died.
He died. That made it difficult for them to get married. I just here's a book I would really encourage you to get a hold of. It's not a long book. John Piper, I don't agree with some of John Piper's theology. He's a little bit more on the charismatic side in some ways, but when he writes history, it's really, really good. And he's written, I have a book that is a collection of 21 stories, and there's 7 books that each has 3 stories in it. Dr. Heron actually gave my wife and me the big book. It has all the collection. So this is one of the 7, and it has 3 in them. And they're the lives of, you can see them here, John Bunyan, William Cooper, famous English hymnist, and David Brainerd. And they all had one thing in common. You guess what it was? What was their one struggle?
Patience?
Well, that too, yeah. Yeah, they all 3 struggle with depression. And that's why he titles this The Hidden Smile of God, because each one of them, even though they struggle with depression, they all saw the face of God in their ministries in certain ways that kept them going and kept them encouraged when they could have otherwise just given up. And he does a really good job. John Piper is to be commended for this and the other ones that he has written as well. But I read this when I was in Brazil, and it really encouraged me. So, you know, if you ever just struggle with discouragement, you know, that sort of thing, I think you'll find these to be really, really edifying, because they're written from a positive perspective, even though these guys struggle with this. Okay, The Hidden Smile of God. This does not involve Brainerd per se. By the way, Brainerd died of what?
Tuberculosis.
Tuberculosis, right? At least they called it consumption, which is either the same thing or very much like it. So I guess nobody can prove for sure that it was tuberculosis. My uncle, I have an uncle that died at the age of 21. Obviously, I never met him. Tuberculosis. My mother helped care for him in the last days of his life, and she ended up getting scarred lung tissue as a result. She had 60% scarring. I never knew it until she was on her deathbed. She would always be short on stamina, you know, and we as a family couldn't understand why she just didn't have very much endurance. But when she was getting close to dying, they did a test and discovered she was scarred. But anyway, that's probably what killed him. Now, here's the thing. Let me say one more thing about David Brainerd. How many years did he minister? Do you remember that?
Like 10?
5 years. Only 5. He dies at the age of 30-ish. I have that right. Let's make sure on that. 29, I think. Anyway, she tried to nurse him back to health, Jerusha. But they say, how does a guy that only ministered for 5 years, struggled with depression, moved around, didn't see a lot of fruit, why is he so famous today? Do you ever wonder? Does anybody know why? What makes David Brainerd? He is one of the most famous missionaries of the colonial era and even of recent American history, or of American history. What makes him such a famous missionary? Now, Miriam, you might not be familiar with him so much, but you start to ask people what are the 10 most famous missionaries, American missionaries, his name will be near the top sometimes. Why? Because he was very diligent in writing a journal. He wrote profusely. And when he died, his father-in-law to be, Jonathan Edwards, who never became his father-in-law, made sure that those journals were collected and printed and sold. I have a copy on my shelf, the journals of David Brainerd. And for that reason, we know about him, we can talk about him. Piper can write about him.
Who publishes journals?
Well, Jonathan Edwards made sure that it happened. I don't know who actually published them, and I can't even tell you where to find them today. If you just Google it, Diary of David Brainerd, a Journal of David Brainerd, you'll find it. It's not hard to get. When you read, I've never read them exhaustively, but I've read bits and pieces, and you do get the impression. Two things come to mind about Brainerd. Number one, he does deal a lot with depression. And part of the reason is because he is super introspective. He's constantly looking at how bad he is, how awful and sinful, unworthy, and all that he is. Okay. But on the positive side, he really does exalt the greatness and beauty of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so it's an interesting combination. He really loves to meditate on the Lord. And so, how those two actually work together is a bit mysterious. I would just say this to anybody that wrestles with depression. I realize, and let me just preface it by saying, I realize that sometimes there are organic things that can cause depression. Okay, hormones and diet and illnesses and even COVID shots. I mean, there are things, but assuming, I'm going to make a statement related to those who suffer depression for non-organic reasons, okay? Sometimes it's easy for people like that to spend so much time being introspective and thinking about themselves that they actually make an idol of themselves without intending to. And I've talked to people and told them, look, I said, you're spending so much time being introspective on how bad you are, you're actually making yourself an idol. So you need to be focusing on the beauty of the face of the Lord Jesus Christ. Not that you ignore who you are, but you can't make that your steady diet. And I think, and so he did have some kind of a combination that kept him going. Even though he struggled with depression, he did, and that's what we want to remember about Brainerd. So, interesting person. This has nothing to do with Brainerd because he was way up north. This is just a summary of what's going on in the southern part of the United States in the same general period of time. A lot of Indian removal, okay? And your book does deal with one guy named McCoy who actually got involved in that as a politician. And he never intended for what happened to happen. But as a result of what he did, he tried to defend the Indians, but as a result, he ended up pushing for Indian removal. His motive was to protect them from extinction. But what happened, as you know, the whole history of Indian removal is that they end up getting confined to reservations, and their living conditions were minimal at best. And they lost their lands. Remember that the natives considered their lands to belong to their ancestors. So the whole idea of them losing their lands was to lose that which belonged to their ancestors. And there's so much to this, but these are some. Here's a painting that it's a famous painting of the Indian removal. And just to kind of try to describe what happened. Many, many, many died on the way. Indians had to put up with the sickness of the white man, and we'll talk about that as well in this story. So we got 10 minutes or so. Let's got a little more than that. Let's get started with Whitman's, okay? Have you guys heard of Marcus and Narcissa Whitman before? If you took intro to missions, I know we touched on it briefly, but they're not as well known, okay? So, romance. This keeps these stories exciting, Actually, what happened here is the romance I'm talking about, let me just back up, is not between him and her. Okay, it's a different romance. So let's see. Whoops, sorry. There's a man, another man whose name is Spalding. You guys read about him for today, okay? So tell me, who can kind of give me a summary of kind of what goes on here in the romance part of this story?
Wasn't this other guy interested in Narcissa,
Yes.
but she turned him down?
Yes.
I thought this story was really interesting.
I did too.
What made it interesting to you?
That they ended up traveling together. Like with her spouse that she didn't turn down, and then him with the new spouse.
I want to laugh and I want to cry.
And just the fact that she was waiting for someone who really wanted to do like the same work that she wanted to do.
Uh-huh.
So that was interesting, and then it worked out. So.
Yeah.
What's really random, it's a random fact, but I just read a novel, I know, during school. But the whole book it was a fiction book, but by the time I got to the end, there was like historical things, and it was actually like a retelling of this in a fictional story.
Oh,
And so it
really?
was like really cool seeing like the Whitmans and the Spaldings in it. It was just kind of fun.
Were they in it by name or just the
The
same?
Spaldings were, she changed the name for the Whitmans. She kept Narcissus, or whatever her name is, like similar, but she changed it a little bit because she added some like facts about them that weren't true just to make it more interesting.
Okay,
But it was really funny reading that and then realizing that we're going to talk about them.
yeah, that's interesting. They have a picture, she has a picture of the Spalding in here, right? In the book.
Yeah.
And you look at the picture and, you know, where is it? Yeah, page 91. You know, he's not exactly the kind of guy that, you know, would catch a girl's eye maybe at first glance. But as you know from the reading, things turn out actually a little bit better in terms of ministry for this guy than for the Whitmans. So yeah, so Marcus comes along, and of course he's a doctor, and he asks her hand in marriage, and they are married. So what is the honeymoon?
The trip all the way out west.
It's amazing. Go ahead, Laura. Sorry.
Oh, not a whole lot, but just like it was a marriage of convenience. I don't know.
It was. That's not uncommon among missionaries because a lot of these missionaries had the idea that I need a partner. I need a spouse to go, and so and not just the women felt that way. A lot of the men did too. And so it was sometimes almost more of a business contract than it was a romance. But of course, we Westerners are in the minority when it comes to romance in the relationship, right? I mean, in most of the 2/3 world, marriages are arranged. Romance only comes later. But in our part of the world, the romance, it needs to come early on, right? Yeah, so what happens? They have these wagon trains that went out west, right? And the wagon trains only went occasionally, maybe a few times a year. And so they would have to take advantage of a wagon train. Why did they have to go in wagon trains?
You don't want to travel out there alone.
No, you had to face the Native Americans and everything else out there, you know, and so they would go in large groups. You know, in fact, have you ever heard somebody say, "I'm riding shotgun"?
Mm-hmm.
You understand what that means, right? You got the driver of this coach, and the guy sitting next to him in the passenger seat has a gun. So he's riding shotgun, literally. But we still use that today, you know. Yeah, I'll go along with you. I'll ride shotgun. You're sitting in the passenger seat. And so they're thinking, okay, if we don't go now, it's going to be like 6 months before the next wagon train goes, or, you know, maybe it's fall of the year and the next one's not going until spring. So we got to hurry up and get married and get going. And so not only did they go on the same wagon train, but they slept in the same tent. Now, this is not a pup tent, okay? You know, I mean, they're pretty good sized tents, but still, I mean, you look at it and you say, that is weird. And it is. Okay, but they were looking at convenience, at practicality. You packed as little as possible. Why didn't they each of them have their own nice tent? Because when you're on a wagon train, you have to pack very, very sparingly. And so, and I guess, you know, sometimes because they're all servants of the Lord, they may make this mistake of assuming that we'll be fine because we're all serving the Lord together. And man, be careful you don't make that assumption. Just because you're all serving the Lord together doesn't necessarily mean you're all going to get along just fine. We still wrestle with the flesh. Yeah, so they're sleeping, and she makes this, you know, kind of indirect statement. Somewhere under the moon, one of those nights, you know, they conceived a child. Yeah. But they end up going to two completely different destinations. The Whitmans go where? Do you remember where they ended up? What would it be today? What state would it be today where the Whitmans landed? They ended up in this modern state of Washington. It was all called Oregon Territory at that time. Okay, are you guys old enough to remember the Oregon Trail video game, or was that before your time? Did you ever play that one, or was that before?
I'm very.
I'm very
I've heard
still
of
let
the
me play
Oregon
video
Trail.
games.
When my older kids were young, we come home and throw, and that was cutting edge, the Oregon Trail. Yep, it's a big video game, but it doesn't exist anymore. But the Whitmans went out there, and Henry Spalding ends up going to what would be today part of Idaho. Okay, he marries a gal named Eliza, and Marcus marries. Her name is. Oh, help me! I want to say Priscilla, but it's not. What's her name?
Narcissa?
Narcissa. Thank you. So, okay. Here's the problem. The Whitmans are going to be working among a tribe that is known for being pretty hostile, okay? Not friendly. The Spaldings end up working with a group of a tribe that is very much more friendly, not as warlike. That's part of the problem, but that's not the main problem, okay? The main problem is really something else. We talk about this, the Whitmans getting tangled up in business. Now let's be fair to them, okay? It wasn't just, oh, we're going to start a big business, make a lot of money. That's not what's happening here, okay? When they went out there, remember Marcus is a what by profession? He's a medical doctor, okay? So he has the ability to help people that way. And they settled at a place that was a crossroads of traders and, people passing through. And so they end up becoming a part of a growing settlement. Because more and more people are going out there, trade is increasing, and so this settlement begins to grow. And like it or not, they have to manage this thing. And so they become entangled in business because they have to. I mean, they wouldn't have, they could leave, but they felt like they should stay there and help to manage this. And here he is, he's a doctor. Okay, now think, you're a Native American out there in the Northwest, right? This witch doctor comes. Now, he's not a witch doctor, okay, but I'm just looking at it from a Native American standpoint. And what did the settlers bring with them that was new to the Indians? Something they hadn't had to worry about before.
Different diseases.
Diseases that the Indians had never, so they had no resistance. So they start getting sick with European, / colonial diseases, right? And they're looking at this Whitman guy, and he's a doctor, and they're looking at him as this witch doctor that's casting spells on them. And some of them are thinking, this guy is out here to get rid of us. We're going to be extinct. He's going to wipe us out and take over our land. You see, that's the mentality. What do you do if you're a medical doctor? He's trying to convince them otherwise. And even when he gives medication to them to try to help them, they think he's poisoning them or he's infecting them with their diseases. See, this is serious business. So, we a lot of people throw stones at Marcus Whitman, and he did some things that were not right. But remember, we're still talking early on in missions history, at least in the New World. And he did have this, he had to face this situation. What do you do? And so they got tangled up in this business, and it comes to a boiling point when finally the Native Americans, think, okay, I mean, smallpox, is one of those diseases that it can wipe out hordes of people at one time. Remember, the Indians, they're not going to view this as a medical disease. They're viewing this as a spiritual thing going on. The spirit world is wiping them out with this. If there's a spell or, a curse that's being cast on them, it's all spiritual. And so finally, the day comes when a couple of Native Americans come upon the unsuspecting group there, and they wipe them out. They didn't kill very many women, but they did kill Narcissa because she was the wife of the witch doctor. Okay, but the others they didn't kill. They didn't know when to kill the women. So, I want to just encourage you when you read a story like this that you be careful not to just look at the Whitmans as being, materialistic or, or failures or, whatever. There's a whole lot more to the story. That when this happened, news got back to the colonies and they sent the army out there and practically wiped out. I mean, just lots of crazy things happen as reactions to this sort of thing. So you look at the results of the two, and, humanly speaking, Whitman's were a failure, by and large. Nothing really was left after that happened. And humanly speaking, the Whitmans were the success story, because many people came to Christ. Henry and Eliza had a great ministry among them. But I would just say this in conclusion this morning. When all the dust is settled and we stand before Jesus, we might find that Jesus didn't view things quite the way we do. We are very, we view things based on the evidence that we have, statistics and all that. And I think we might be surprised when we stand before the Lord someday and realize maybe the Whitmans did a lot more for the Lord than meets the eye. And we just have to leave that in the hands of the Lord. Okay, well, is that the last blank? Yeah, that just shows the trail going out. All right, time is up.
2 questions.
Yeah,
The Whitmans went to Washington State and the Spaldings went to Idaho.
yeah.
And we have a quiz Wednesday.
No, Friday.
Say that again, Sharon?
The Whitmans went to Washington and the Spaldings.
If you look on the map, you can see, there it is, Lopoi, Idaho, and today, which is Walla Walla, Washington, South Washington. That's the location right there.
And where were they coming from again?
I don't remember. That's a good question.
Like, that's a huge difference to split up after traveling.
It is. But I don't remember what it was out way back east, but I don't remember the exact location. I'm not gonna ask it on the quiz. Thanks. If I do, I'll be unjust in doing so, right?